Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Chris Hammond, and what we talk about on this channel is retirement planning, retirement issues for people that are maybe already retired or maybe about 10 years or less away from being retirement. And for today, we're going to talk about a really kind of confusing issue that most of us will eventually probably come across, and it's how do inherited IRAs work for non-spouses? Now, if you have, like, let's say, for example, you're a 50-year-old individual, you have a mother or a father who's 80, 90, something like that, and they have an IRA and they've listed you as one of the beneficiaries on that IRA. So you're not a spouse, but you have to figure out, what am I going to do? What are the rules with how this works for the inherited IRA that I'm going to get? When do I have to take money out of it? How do I make sure I don't just get killed on taxes when I do take the money out? Well, that's what this video is going to address. So, well, probably the biggest thing, and they've changed the rules on this that were effective at the beginning of 2020. It used to be back in the good old days before 2020 that if you inherited an IRA, you had this option, regardless of how old you were, or if it was your spouse or not your spouse or whatnot, that you could actually, the distributions you had to take from that IRA, you had to take something out every year, but that distribution would be based on your life expectancy. Okay, so if you're younger and your life is, so say you're a 25-year-old individual and your life expectancy is another 60 years, then the amount that you had to take from that inherited IRA would be actually pretty small, and you would be able to stretch that out for a long time, continue to have the money invested and growing tax deferred, taking your withdrawal and paying the tax on it, which probably wouldn't boost you up into much of a higher tax bracket because the distribution required would be so much smaller, right? Well, those rules changed. Now, obviously, you could have taken out all of it, the day after the funeral when you inherited the IRA, but they gave you that option where you could stretch it out. Well, now for people that have passed away in 2020 and beyond, the rules are different for how people inherit it. Now, the one we're going to talk about today is what if you're a non-spouse? Like, this is where a lot of people are going to find themselves in that situation. They have parents that have aging or getting close to passing away, and now you're going to inherit this IRA. Well, one thing you have to understand is, when do I have to take the money out? Like, how did the rules change? If I can no longer just take out the minimum amount and stretch it out for the rest of my life, which may be over 30 years, depending on your age and your life expectancy, they have tables that calculate all this. If you can't do that anymore, then when do you have to take it out? Well, the IRS does give us some answers to that. It's in Form 590B. It tells us, but the only problem is it can be kind of confusing at the same time. So we're going to walk through this, and I'll show you how the rules are. Now, first is we just kind of lay the ground rules. We've got to get this one big definition out of the way. There's a thing called an eligible, emphasis on the word eligible, an eligible designated beneficiary. That is, and this is just a screenshot straight from Form 590B. If you guys are listening to this on the podcast, it's okay. I'm about to read it to you. But an eligible designated beneficiary, as defined on Form 590B, is an IRA beneficiary, is an eligible designated beneficiary if the beneficiary is the owner's surviving spouse, the owner's minor child, a disabled individual, a chronically ill individual, or any other individual who's not more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner. Now, that's kind of a lot to throw at you, and you can already see how this stuff can get a little confusing, especially that last phrase. That's a very oddly confusing worded. Who is not more than 10 years younger than the IRA? So it's kind of confusing there. Now, if you're the child of the deceased and you inherit their IRA, I mean, obviously you're going to be more than 10 years younger than them. You're not going to be an eligible designated beneficiary unless you're disabled or chronically ill or something like that. We're not going to go into all those little nuances. So first of all, you've got to understand what an eligible designated beneficiary is. And in most cases, you're not going to be one unless you're the surviving spouse. So what's a designated beneficiary? Well, A designated beneficiary, we don't have to overthink this. That's just literally if your name is listed on the account as the beneficiary, you're a designated beneficiary. Okay. Now, so a designated beneficiary who's not one of those eligible designated beneficiaries, like I just went over, they have to have all the money out of the IRA completed within 10 years of the death of the owner. Okay. So that's that. Think if you're not the spouse, in all likelihood, you're going to fall under that 10-year rule. Now, the IRS in Form 590B, they do tell us what the 10-year rule is. And again, this is just another screenshot from it. The 10-year rule requires the IRA beneficiaries who are not taking life expectancy payments. So essentially, if you're not one of those eligible ones, then you're probably not taking life expectancy payments. But they require them to withdraw the entire balance of the IRA by December 31st of the year that contains the 10th anniversary of the owner's death. They give us an example here, which is really helpful. It says, for example, if the owner died in 2022, the beneficiary would have to fully distribute the IRA by December 31st, 2032. So if somebody died in November of 2022, by December 31st of 2032, you have to have all that money out of that IRA that you inherited from them. All right. So they kind of lay it down like pretty easy to understand on that. Now, the 10-year rule applies. First of all, it can apply to an eligible designated beneficiary if they choose to fall under the 10-year rule. But, if you're not a spouse and you're probably not going to fall under all those other reasons either, you're probably just going to be a designated beneficiary. So the beneficiary is a designated beneficiary who is not eligible designated beneficiary, regardless of whether the owner died before reaching his or her required beginning date. Required beginning date, again, is one of those kind of like all these phrases, they're coming from everywhere. What all do they mean? Required beginning date is just when the IRA owner had to start making distributions. So it's like age 72. Now it's age 73. Again, tax code always changes and all that kind of stuff. You got to stay on top of it. But that's what they're talking about there. So if you're not a spouse, and you don't fall into those other little kind of nuanced categories, then you have the 10-year rule is in effect. Now, you don't have to wait until 10 years is up. You can take money out in the meantime, but by December 31st of that 10th year, you have to have the money out or they're going to have penalties against you. Now, speaking of penalties, there's an excise tax rate for excess accumulations reduced. The excise tax rate, this is, again, another screenshot. The excise tax rate for distributions that are less than the required minimum distribution is reduced to 25% for tax years beginning in 2023 and after. So required minimum distributions, they used to have a penalty that if you didn't pull out the full distribution, you had to pay a 50% tax on what you didn't pull out. So if you had to make a distribution of $10,000 that year, and let's say you only pulled out $5,000, and there was a whole other $5,000 that you didn't pull out that you've got to pay a 50% penalty on, or $2,500, right? Well, they have reduced that penalty starting in 2023 and going forward to now be 25%. And it also goes on to say you may be subject to a reduced excise tax rate of 10% of the amount that's not distributed if you correct the fact that you missed that distribution within an appropriate window of time. Okay. So again, tax law changes, but 25% penalty, 10% penalty, whichever it is, you don't want to have to pay the penalty. And you want to be sure that you stay on top of this. And it can, and truthfully, it's going to be it can be hard to, if you have this account, to remember, was that already, have 9 years already passed now since Uncle Bill passed away? Do I have to distribute it? That can get confusing, because everything always feels like, well, it probably happened 3 years ago. I mean, something could have happened 15 years ago with me, and I would say, it feels like it happened about 3 years ago. So this is something you gotta keep on top of to make sure that you don't make any mistakes when it comes to this. Okay, so the big takeaway here is that the tax code is complex and it's always changing. Just in this right here, those snapshots from the 590B form were showing that the changes of the penalty have been reduced from 50% down to 25%, and maybe even 10% if you correct the fact that you missed a distribution. Tax code's always changing. This is one of those areas where if you're wanting to minimize your taxes long term, like in retirement, you're probably going to do better getting professional help to minimize it, as opposed to learning the tax code all by yourself. There are mistakes that can be made. If you might be thinking you're doing one thing that's related to the income tax you pay, but it could be triggering other taxes elsewhere. I call them like indirect taxes. That's not an official term or anything, but other taxes that could be triggered that are not even related to your income tax. Things like IRMA, there's other things out there like that. So you have to really be careful when it comes to doing tax planning, and getting professional help is usually going to be the easier route than learning the tax code yourself and staying on top of all the changes that happen to it. Now, this would fall under, on the 5 pillars of a comprehensive retirement plan. That's retirement planning is my niche, by the way. Of course, I'm sure you guys knew that by the nature of the topics of this channel, but that's going to fall under the pillar of tax planning, is what this is going to fall under right there. Okay, really important stuff. All right, that's all I got. So if you want some additional help on planning for your retirement, feel free to head on over to retirementplanningmadeeasy.com. At the top of the page, you'll see this link that you can click on to get a free copy of the essential step-by-step retirement guide. It's going to go through some of the very fundamental issues related to retirement, things that you need to get answered, things like cash flow, income that's coming in. What's your Social Security going to be? There's a worksheet that you can fill out and put your own personalized numbers in it, so you can understand, is my income in retirement going to be enough to cover my expenses? And if it's not, what level of savings do I need to reach in order to be safe in retirement? As far as do I have a very low likelihood of running out of money in 15 to 20 years or 30 years from now? So just head on over there, and you can download a free copy of that. That's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video.